Well, one of the few bright spots of the 2020 COVID crisis happened about a year ago, maybe a little bit more, but somewhere around a year ago. I remember in New York City, as they were fighting the worst of the infection, which occurred in early April, spontaneously, New Yorkers would, at 6 o'clock in the afternoon, go outside early evening and just start bashing pots and pans as a sign of respect and admiration for the healthcare workers who were out there in the hospitals, and things were looking really bad. And that went on for several weeks, if not months. And I remember thinking, that's pretty cool. I am very wary of the term hero, which I think has been horrifically overused. But when you're dealing with individuals who are going to work with infected people, and we still didn't know how infectious it was, and there weren't enough masks going on, I thought that was a worthy thing to call the healthcare workers, and I still do. Hi, everybody. I'm Bill Whittle here with Steve Green and Scott Ott, and I'd like to talk today a little bit about the anti-heroes and what we can do about them, because if there's one group that has performed just abysmally, even worse than healthcare officials during this crisis, I think it's got to go to the legions of teachers that are playing hooky and refuse to go back to school no matter what the situation. Guys, we originally were going to turn this into one of my favorite pastimes, which is a general 15-minute bitch fest. We talked not too long ago about the idea that teachers wanted to be first in line for vaccinations on account of them being on the front lines, but didn't want to go back to school and wanted to teach using video conferencing. But they were willing to send unvaccinated proctors to schools to help them to get that across on the other end of the line. I was kind of keen on the story based on a single tweet that went out. One of the school individuals of the National Teachers Association. This is the original quote. Betty Pringle, president of the National Education Association, said she anticipates schools will open this fall, but not necessarily with full classrooms. She wants more research first. In other words, we need to know more about this disease before teachers go back to school. To which Hans Fein responded, in the last year, I've gone from lightly supporting vouchers programs to vociferously supporting the complete, utter, and eternal destruction of public schools. Amen. So rather than making this a complaint session, I thought what we might do is talk about some ways that we might learn from this catastrophe of the teachers' unions, their unwillingness to teach, their utter disregard as a group anyway, for students, and their selfishness and all the rest of it. Steve, this has been a bad year for young people. I think that this year of isolation and social distancing and video teaching has caused kids who are already ever more trending into living through their phones and living isolated cyber lives. What little social contact they were getting, they were deprived of. A lot of students missed the prom, for example, and all the rest, football games. Anything that still brought kids physically together has disappeared, and I think that's a catastrophe. But what can we learn, perhaps, from the idea that these teachers' unions, not a surprise to many of us, are so irredeemably selfish and uncommitted to success? What can we do differently, do you think, moving forward in terms of the educational system?
Before I get to the positive stuff, I very briefly need to do something that you may be completely unfamiliar with. So it might confuse you for a moment, but I'm going to have to correct you on something. I know. Sorry. I just didn't mean to startle you in that way. The hero of a story is somebody who does the right thing for the right reasons. The anti-hero isn't the opposite of the hero. An anti-hero is somebody who does the right thing, but for the wrong reasons or in the wrong way. An anti-villain is the villain who does something right, but for the wrong reasons. And the villain is the person who does the wrong things for the wrong reasons. The teachers here are not anti-heroes. They're the villains of this story. And they made themselves the villains of this story. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Let's get to the positive stuff. The first thing I would do is get the kids out more. Not all kids learn that well in a classroom, at a desk, in rows, lined up. we need more imaginative settings, I think. I remember, wow, I hadn't thought of this story in decades. My grandparents were throwing a party for something, and there's always that one guest that will pigeonhole, or not pigeonhole, just kind of trap somebody in a conversation to talk about their obsession after they've had a couple of drinks. And since you're trying to be polite, you just got to sit there and nod your head a lot until they're done with their rant, and in a friendly way, of course, the rant. And this gentleman was in the construction business, if I recall, was telling me about a school that he saw under construction. And he said, there was the most shocking thing missing from this school as I watched them build it. It wasn't his company doing this thing. And I said, what was it? He said, windows. It looked like a prison. And he told me what the school was, and this stuck in my mind long enough that when I was able to drive, because I was probably 12, 13 years old when I had this conversation, when I was able to drive a few years later, I drove past that school. And yeah, it looked like a prison. That's no way to learn. Kids need air, they need exercise, they need activity, especially boys who just tend to have more energy to work off and learn in different ways than girls do. The other thing I would do really has more to do with high school. I would, elementary school too, I would end social promotion and I would go back to advancement. My dad graduated high school when he was 16 because he went from first grade to fourth grade because that's where his skill set was. His best friend was a more typical student and was 2 years older than he was. And there was a lot more mingling of kids and ages by their abilities, not just by when their birthday was. I think that was a smarter way to do things. And I almost never say this, but in high school, I would look to the German model. I would have a trade track when instead of everybody has to go to college. A trade track would include bringing back things like woodworking and heck, you could have plumbing in school and all of this stuff. I think it would be great. Bring back auto shop, bring back all of this stuff for the hands-on things that applies to a lot of students who can then go on to earning great money in blue-collar jobs without loading themselves up with a bunch of senseless student debt. I would bring back civics class so that students would understand why public education is so important, because they've learned about the foundations of this country and the things that they need to propagate so that their children can be as successful or more successful than they hope to be. And lastly, I would make a mandatory class for all juniors and seniors that would be sort of a not home ec, but college ec, where you would learn about the economics of various degrees, about the amount of money you would have to spend to get these degrees, and about the number of years it would take you to pay back the debt you are shouldering to earn these degrees. And I think that would get a lot of kids out of these debt traps that our public education system, and particularly our federalized student loan program, has encouraged.
Scott, before I get to you, just a quick follow-up, Steve. You said that you thought there should be more windows in these schools. If there were more windows in the classroom, doesn't that mean that students would be looking out the window and daydreaming, using their imagination, things of that nature? Isn't that the exact opposite of what you want when you're talking about educating children? No, it isn't. In fact, my segment this week was talking about kids and imagination. And you know what? No kid is 100% focused all the time. No adult is 100% focused all the time. If we didn't daydream, Bill, I don't think we'd get anything done. And when you're sitting there with a book, whether it's a school book that you're reading for class, or a book that you're reading for pleasure, and something strikes that magical spark of imagination, you got to take a minute and go with that. And yeah, even if it's in the middle of math class, you can make it up. You can make it up later. I would have thought that burying students several miles below the earth in concrete bunkers would have been the way to teach them, as long as the graphics were good enough. Right. Scott, one of the things we talked about was prior to shooting the show was the idea that traditionally in this country, and really pretty much everywhere, is the idea that all 12-year-olds are 12-year-olds, and this is what they need to be educated on. You go through classes every year, and you move with your cohort, and everybody's the same age. And it's clear that people don't learn at the same levels and so on. There are people who learn more quickly than others more slowly. And as you pointed out, some more quickly in some subjects and less quickly in others. Does this implosion on the part of the teachers unions give us an opportunity to really rethink the way classes are structured and make it a lot more permeable for people's learning propensities to be a little more reflective of reality?
That's my sincerest hope. I think that this last year or so has provided a great laboratory for some ideas that education reformers have been advancing for years and years, and not just homeschool advocates or charter school advocates or private school advocates or voucher advocates, but people who were looking within the context of the public school system and saying, how can we reform this? How can we make this more effective? I had the distinct privilege of being a school bus driver a number of years ago, and my bus had kids who were classified as having learning disabilities and behavior disorders, which, believe me, is a beautiful mix. You need to really... You really need to get both of those sets of kids, the kids who are on your bus because they pulled a knife on a teacher, and the kid who's a delightful little third grade Down syndrome child. You need to put them in the same bus. And I'm only being slightly facetious because actually that turned out to be almost magical. Because what happened was the older kids who tended to be, bullies or people who had been social outcasts for one reason or another were going to a special school because they didn't fit in or had, some sort of attention problem, actually began to develop a sense of responsibility for their leadership of the third grade Down syndrome kids and kids who had other learning disabilities. And it was really a great, I had 17-year-olds on the bus and I had 8-year-olds on the bus. It was like a little house on the prairie schoolhouse. And for those old enough to remember their grandparents, there were a lot of Americans who grew up in schools where all grades were in one room and the teacher's responsibility was to help guide all those people. And she couldn't do that because she couldn't be taking care of the second grader at the same time she was taking care of the high school junior. And so what she would do is have the high school junior take care of the second grader. And in the course of teaching a second grader how to read or a fifth grader how to do math, that the 11th grader got better at learning because there's nothing better to teach you how to learn than to be forced to teach something. So this is a great thing. And the other thing I learned from these kids is on my school bus, almost every one of these children had something called an IEP. I don't know what they call them these days. And I know now the latest term I heard was kids with intellectual disabilities. That's the current popular term for people who are not able to keep up in school for a variety of reasons. They had individual education plans. And those plans were come up with in concert with the parents and the teachers and the counselors at the school because that child needed a special plan to guide her because she didn't fit in the cookie cutter with every other student in the third grade, so to speak. As a result, you tailored the education to the abilities and the proclivities of the child you were dealing with. And I came out of that experience thinking every child needs an IEP. Every child needs to sit down with the teacher and the parents, not just at open house night where you go in and they go, oh, Billy's a very good kid and here's a thing he drew with crayon that we've had pinned to the bulletin board. But you need an opportunity to sit down and talk about their strengths and their weaknesses and how we can encourage their strengths and how we can mitigate their weaknesses and help them advance. And then what Steve suggested, or maybe it was Bill, there's no reason in the world why every 12-year-old has to move at the same pace on every subject through the process. I was extraordinarily adept at things like languages. So not only did I take 5 years of French in junior high and high school, but I had 3 years of Spanish. They wouldn't let me take German as well. I wanted to take German. And they literally told me, I can remember this conversation with the vice principal. I said, look, I want to sign up for German. I've got plenty of free time available. It's my senior year. I'd like to take German. And he said, well, no, we've never had anybody take 3 languages at the same time, Scott. And I said, well, that's what you told me 3 years ago when I asked to take Spanish along with French. You said you'd never had anybody take 2 languages at the same time. What kind of rule is that? But they forbid me. They forbid me from taking German, and they didn't even offer Latin. I would have certainly taken that. But even though I was very excited about that. I was terrible at trigonometry and calculus and geometry and stuff like that. I needed extra help there, but I felt like I had held on to, a motorcycle and I was being dragged down the highway, bouncing along on the pavement behind the rest of the class in trigonometry. I'm like, I'll never get this. And the basic principles were back there at mile marker 3, and now we're at mile marker 17, and I don't know what they're even talking about. So if you had an individual education program that allowed a student to move at their own pace through a mix of classroom instruction, at-home instruction from parents, video classroom stuff, as well as what Steve suggested, which is get the heck outdoors. I probably learned more about biology and nature by actually being in it, by being in the woods and playing in the creek and catching fish and salamanders and crayfish in my bare hands and building dams. I learned more about hydrodynamics by building dams. And also by having boat races, which were, we knew that they were super, one of those cigarette racing boats, but really they were little pieces of wood. Like we broke a stick off and we had a boat race down the creek. That was more instructive out in nature than anything that could have happened in the classroom. In any case, all of this to say that I hope that this strange occasion will not make us say, oh, dear God, we've got to get these children back inside those prison farms, but would rather open up parents' minds and say, you know what? My kid should not be chugging along at the pace of the slowest vessel in the convoy. My kid has advanced abilities in these areas, and my kid needs extra help in these areas. And there are other ways to learn other than sitting in perfectly straight rows and waiting to raise your hand or trying not to raise your hand for the teacher.
Well, the thing about American public schools is that for most of the history of this country, for 250 years of this country, round numbers, the American public school system was the envy of the world. People would come from ambassadors and kings would come from other countries just to see a country that educated everybody for free to a very high level. And into the 60s and probably even into the 70s, American public school students led the world in everything, math, science, all of that. And then along came leftism, really, and then came the unions, and then teachers who could not be fired, and on and on and on and on and on. And now we are well, with last count, 27th at average. I'm sure it's fallen since then. Yeah. So clearly something has happened. And what has happened has been this idea that teachers are not accountable for the results. It used to be that an educational system was designed to take a box, which was a child, and send it out the door when it was finished out of the factory with an education inside. And now we no longer worry about whether there's anything in the box. All we care about is how many boxes come out the door. Doesn't matter if there's nothing in the box. Doesn't matter if the thing inside the box is broken. All we're doing is counting the number of people come out of the school system as our success. Just briefly, in terms of educational reform, I was extremely fortunate to have gone to British schools growing up when I was in Bermuda. And their system was completely different, so different that when I came to the United States, I was simply shocked, really shocked. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but one of the problems with much of the public education today is that there doesn't seem to be any curiosity. You have the ability to get all the answers you want from the internet. You ask young people today, well, you don't know anything. Oh, I don't have to know anything. I can go to the internet to get the answers. Yeah, but you don't know what questions to ask. For most of my early childhood in elementary school, which is called primary school, this is no exaggeration, we had a weekly schedule rather than a daily schedule, which meant that during the course of a week, we would have double periods, 2-hour periods, and so on. In my elementary school years, this is no exaggeration. At any one year, I was taking physics, chemistry, biology, history, geography, metal shop, wood shop, physical education, Spanish, history. I think we had a reading class, and the reading class consisted of students reading sections of The Invisible Man or Day of the Triffids or something like that. So we were exposed to so many different things, and the teachers stayed with us year after year. We had the same chemistry teacher, we had the same physics teacher, and so on and so on and so on. And it made you curious about everything. And it also had a very competitive system of ranking. There was incentive to do well in those schools. I don't know what we do to recover public education. Needless to say, if I had a child today, I would not send it into public school system to be indoctrinated to hate everything I stood for. Homeschooling is a solution, but it's not the best solution. The best solution would be to return to a public education system that allowed children to socialize, as Steve and Scott both said, spend time outdoors, be exposed to large numbers of different subjects to find out what really did hold their interest from an early age, and then have the fluidity to allow children to move quickly through subjects that they were naturally good at and be able to slow down on subjects where they were naturally not so good at. But I think of all the things on the table, the one thing that strikes me most about what we no longer have in the American public school system was what we had in these mythical but also factual days of the Little Red Schoolhouse out on the prairie, where one usually young woman, often an unmarried young woman, would be responsible for teaching the 60 or 70 kids in that particular area. That teacher had to know how to teach first graders and eighth graders and 12th graders, had to teach them in the same room, had to make sure that all of them were doing their best. It had that kind of fluidity. But I think more than anything else in the world, what it had was it had a sense of ownership. It had a sense of ownership, that teacher owned those students' educations. That usually woman was responsible for each one of these children coming out of her care with an actual useful education. And because there was individual ownership on the part of the teacher for every one of those kids entrusted to their care, we ended up producing the best educated people in the world. And there's no reason why that sense of ownership cannot return, where a teacher could essentially be given a set of students and be responsible then for the 5 or 6 years through elementary school, the 5 or 4 years in high school, and be personally responsible for their education. Any number of opportunities out there, any number of chances to do something, but clearly what we've got is not only broken, it's actually become evil. And one of the few benefits of this pandemic is it's shown us just how little the professional unionized teachers care about their students, care about education, care about results. If there was ever a time to do it, this is it. So why don't we stop complaining about things and start to figure out how to make this happen, at least in areas where we can opt into it. That'll do it for this edition of Right Angle. It's made possible by the members of BillWhittle.com. We're very grateful for your support, and we'll see you right here next week on Right Angle.